Hello, this evening we're going to do some more of our English practices. We don't have any new Finits review material to explain yet, but definitely we'll have to continue on with these things, except that sometimes there are parts in the afternoon set of questions that we really need to take a little bit more of our time, especially if the question requires you to think a lot to know where things are located and where things are put. And I think for that we need more time where there aren't a lot of these telephone calls. There aren't people constantly asking you questions and things like that. So we'll definitely need to make time for those things. Meanwhile, um, with regard to what I can do, I've been definitely continuing on with reading the digital papers, and also if I can do the translation, I usually do them, and I also definitely look first at the article if it's interesting enough to be translated and it aligns with what we want to convey, particularly with regard to reducing the population, increasing know-how, knowledge among peoples, especially for example in Japan, this type of situation occurs in the hospital, in the clinic. We want to know what they're doing, what happened. For example, there's this incident where I think it was a ransomware that got the some of their computers in the hospital. It was, I think, in Osaka, a public hospital, and caused a lot of trouble. And so we want to know how they are handling those incidents. And in other news, we get articles where there's this new discovery, how they could use the genome editing or therapy afterwards, things like that. So things related to health, and then I think what else? Then at times the Vox Populi, where we get stories, usually from the past, stories about what happened many years ago, maybe hundreds of years ago, 50 years ago, what people were doing then. Except that I think not a lot of people read those stuff when I share them because I get the impressions, for example, from LinkedIn. They tell me how many people are interested in something like this. I think the impressions are based on if you click on the more or press the video or something like that. I think that's how it works. So from there we see that, for example, the one that got so far that I can remember, that got a lot of impressions was the one with the syphilis. But for the film nits, I think we do get people who view them, but not as much as the one with the syphilis, where it tells people to, um, well, if you are gonna have sexual intercourse, you better undergo some kind of physical exam first. Okay, so I think with regard to those things, usually translating from Japanese to English, it's much faster than it was several years ago. But there are times too when, because I have to think for the right word, the correct translation, it takes a lot of my time, and then we get people calling and people asking questions about how much they're gonna pay and things like that. And so that's why it takes a little bit longer to do the task. But it's definitely easier than having to come up with a visual map, a mental map of where the parts are located. And so if the task is pretty straightforward, just put this line of code in this function, and then the next one, very quickly, it's super easy to understand that it's related to this one. Then it's pretty fast. But if it's something that you have to think about, you have to come up with, maybe because there's no map yet at all, you have to create the map yourself. Then at times, I would really have to create a space where there aren't anyone bothering me. I think I've learned that from the Philnit's afternoon questions too, because I attempted to answer them in the morning. Phones, I couldn't really continue. And of course, the noise pollution from the cars passing by, from people. They smuggle their terrorists continuously, creating all these unnecessary destruction. And so, what I would do is during lunchtime, I just do the Philnit's review during lunchtime when there will be less people at the clinic, patients particularly, and the phone calls will be less. But there are times when just when lunchtime arrives, phone calls, people buying medicine. So sometimes that occurs, and um, depending on the task, we know that there are things that we can do even though there's a lot of these things happening, noise, phone calls. Um, there are tasks that we can still do pretty well, but for tasks where you have to think a lot, you have to create some kind of visual map, a mental map. I think you need some quiet space, silence. Okay, so from there we can learn how we could survive in an environment where we are really in a dire situation, like for example in war, in things like disasters where people are shouting, people are in disarray. There's a lot of chaos, and I think in those types of situations, if the task that we need to do is straightforward, then I think we can pretty much do a good job. Except that if we need to make some kind of plan, then the guys who are supposed to make a plan, they need to be somewhere far from the noise, from far from the chaos. So something that we can learn from this. Okay, so we'll continue on with some of our practices. Maybe tomorrow, if not with the Philnit's material, then maybe another one of these recordings where I ramble and I share stuff and things like that. Okay, thanks for joining me, and we'll see each other soon.